Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank the IIEA and particularly Joseph Curtin for inviting me to give this talk and for organising this conference. I'd also like to thank my co-authors, who are numerous, Frank Porg, John, Stan, Trevor and Carl. As the director said in his opening address, there's a huge amount of work going on in Teagasc in association with university partners like UCD, Trinity, UCC, Maynooth, to actually come up with mitigation strategies, draw up mitigation strategies for Irish agriculture so that we can move ahead. Okay, I won't go into this in great detail. It's been shown before. As you can see, Irish emissions have been steadily going up from 1990 to the present day. Agricultural emissions, about just under 27% of total emissions, they've been going down. The main driver for increasing emissions has been the energy sector, in particular transport. If we look at a breakdown of agricultural emissions, we can see that they're mainly based around methane and nitrous oxide. 70% of our emissions are methane. Just under 30% of our emissions are nitrous oxide. And where do they come from? Well, most of the methane emissions are from enteric fermentation. That's essentially the fermentation of carbohydrates in animal ruminants. The rest of the methane emissions are from manure management. And then the nitrous oxide emissions are principally from nitrogen deposition either by animals or nitrogen application of synthetic and organic fertilizers on farms. Okay. It's also been mentioned quite a few times about the future challenges that lie ahead. In particular, the post-Kyoto agreements that will come into force. We've heard already that there'll be a 20%. There will be a 20% decrease in emissions from the period 2012 to 2020 and 30% with an agreement. And as a result, agriculture, even though it has reduced its emissions from 1990 to present, will come under sustained pressure to reduce emissions further in the medium term. However, antagonistic to this is, as been stated earlier, the increased global food demand and also the impetus for increased production. Global food demand, abolition of quotas, etc. And also the fact that New Zealand are placing agriculture already within the national emissions trading scheme. There will be more and more impetus and pressure on agriculture globally to reduce emissions. And also, which isn't mentioned much, is that global warming potentials are also due to change. And for nitrous oxide, they're due to go down, but for methane, which, as you saw from the previous slide, is our main emission from agriculture, is due to go up, in fact, from 21 to 25. Okay, now that's the bad news. The good news is that Irish farming is efficient, and that's already been mentioned, but if we just put some figures on it, you can see that for the dairy, the tonnes of greenhouse gas per tonne of energy-adjusted milk, or tonnes of greenhouse gas per tonne of beef, if we compare ourselves to Brazil, Uruguay, we can see we stack up very favourably. And in fact, if you include land use change, deforestation emissions, our efficiency is 3 to 4 times greater than Brazil for dairy, for example, or for beef, and in comparison with Uruguay as well. New Zealand is the gold standard in terms of greenhouse gases per unit product. They are New Zealand's incredibly efficient, but we are comparable with them. So Irish agriculture is efficient, and you can see this if you look at a range of studies. You can see that this production increase and the emissions are quite tightly correlated. So on the y-axis here we have methane emissions, on the x-axis we have milk production. As you increase milk production, as you go to more intensive systems with higher amounts of concentrates, for example, or better genetic merit animals, as you increase production, you generally tend to reduce your emissions per unit product. So what are Teagasc's research objectives? Okay. Mainly, firstly, to assess methane and nitrous oxide mitigation options, looking at nutrient efficiency options, looking at whole farm solutions. And we set this always in the context of maintaining production potential. There's no point coming up with a mitigation strategy that isn't cost effective. We're also looking at refining our emission factors, principally for nitrous oxide, which still has a lot of work to do. We're assessing the impacts of land use management, land use change on total greenhouse gas emission, and particularly on carbon sequestration, assessing the impacts of all of this on soil organic carbon, soil health and soil quality. We're also elucidating the processes that drive these emissions, because you cannot come up with a good mitigation strategy unless you fundamentally understand the process that's driving those emissions. We're also looking at future climatic effects on all our mitigation solutions. So essentially future-proofing and doing risk assessments on them. And also then looking at policy issues, financial consequences of both climate change and mitigation strategies. So, in terms of mitigation strategies, there are 4 fundamentals that you really need to tie in on. The first one is cost benefit and the value of carbon. Any mitigation strategy that you have has to be cost beneficial. Secondly, and Hayden touched on this earlier, you have to be able to verify and monitor it. And this, in a lot of cases, is the elephant in the room, because if you cannot input your mitigation strategies into national inventories, they're worthless. There's a question of permanence. Mitigation strategies that you come up with, they have to be long-lasting and sustainable. And finally, there's any mitigation strategies you come up with, you have to be able to say that it will mitigate emissions relative to if you did nothing. And as has been previously mentioned, you have to take leakage into effect. So you have to do good, thorough life cycle analysis of all of this. Right, so methane abatement strategies for methane, for beef and the dairy sector that Teagasc are engaging in. We're looking at increasing grazing season, improving pasture digestibility, increasing things like clover in swards, replacing roughage with concentrates, reducing finishing times, and increasing genetic merit, and also looking at the fundamental processes that drive methanogenesis, the producing of methane in the rumen. And ancillary to this, Teagasc have now set up a new animal biosciences centre to look at a lot of this. That really for methane, it's an animal husbandry issue. If you can manipulate the diet, reduce the amount of methane produced in the rumen, alter the amount of divert the production of hydrogen away to different pathways, you can essentially reduce the amount of methane. And it's a win-win situation, because methane that's produced by cattle is carbon that could otherwise be either going into milk production or carbon that could be going into live weight gain for beef cattle. Okay, so if we look, for example, length of grazing season, if we can extend the grazing season, it's a fairly cost-beneficial strategy. You don't have to feed extra concentrates, you don't have to graze animals for as long. So if you can push the amount of grazing days that you keep cattle out for, you reduce enteric fermentation because you're not feeding them silage, you reduce silage effluent emissions, you reduce slurry storage emissions, and you can reduce total emissions. And we estimate that if 50% dairy farmers would extend their grazing season, we could mitigate about 300,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents. If we look at forage quality, okay, if we can move to less fibrous forage, that means that the forage is more digestible, it's not sticking around in the rumen as long, and we can mitigate emissions that way by simply passing the food through the rumen quicker. However, if we move to things like maize, for example, we also have to take into account the emissions for ploughing up that land and actually cultivating the maize. And also, there's a question of sustainability. How much of these things like clover, for example, do you have to feed to the animal to see a result, and how long-lasting it is it? Again, the question in terms of mitigation strategy of permanence. And that's something that's been working outside. And urease inhibitors, which inhibits the loss of nitrogen to ammonia. We're looking at clover, so instead of applying synthetic fertilizer, putting clover into pastures and see how much nitrogen that fixes, and also then how much mitigation it takes up. And also looking in a total N level, looking at increasing N efficiency at a farm scale. So use of alternative land spreading strategies, timing of fertiliser application, amendment of slurries, tightening up on the nitrogen balance within a farm. So this is just some brief results from our DCD trials. New Zealand, Lincoln University have shown the growing of these oils, the cultivation and transportation. So you have to be very thorough in terms of your life cycle analysis. These are short to medium term mitigation strategies. In the longer term, we need to move to higher genetic merit. Okay? Increase the amount of product per head, increase fertility so there's less replacements. And underpinning all of this, we need to have more research, and this is being carried out currently in Teagasc with university partners to relate rumen community, the microbial community in the rumen, to production, to understand the biology in order to permit more imaginative future. Is a great catch-all strategy because it has a triple effect. Clover can reduce methane emissions in the rumen. It can reduce nitrous oxide emissions because it fixes atmospheric N and you're not applying synthetic fertiliser. And it's also very good at sequestering carbon. And it also sequesters carbon even more efficiently at higher CO2 concentrations. So into the future, as atmospheric CO2 rises, it sequesters more efficiently. So clover is we're looking at as well, and we're looking at the effects of clover on life cycle analysis, and also then the effects of clover on total greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of overarching strategies then, we're also investigating the effects of REPS and organic farming on total carbon balance, on total greenhouse gas balance. Now, both strategies, as the Minister said earlier, will reduce nitrous oxide emissions and also leaching by about 2/3. And in that way, there's co-benefits for other directives. However, you have to be a little bit careful here because whilst emissions per hectare are reduced, because there is actually less intensive farming, and also because there generally tends to be more roughage in the diet, especially in organic farming, there may be an increase in emissions per unit product. There may not. The jury's still out on that.
3 minutes.
Right, that's no problem. Finally, we're looking at carbon sequestration, okay? We're looking at tillage management, non-inversion tillage, cover cropping, winter versus spring crops. We're looking at pasture management. We're looking at carbon sequestration into the soil via land use management and also land use change, okay? And also biomass crops. And what you can see here is our estimate of how much we reckon you can mitigate emissions using these different strategies. So about maybe 100,000 tonnes for tillage management, 100,000 tonnes for pasture management, maybe even more. Sequestration of carbon via forestry, between 3 and 5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents, and biomass crops. There's a big range. It depends on whether it actually, the planting of biomass crops displaces cattle emissions. And the mitigation potentials, again, in total, on the first column, you can see that there are a lot of strategies here and that can deliver large benefits. In particular, actually, as you can see there, the restoration of organic soil, so the restoration of wetlands and bogs, and also land use change. The permanence issue, finally, in terms of soils, very important. You can sequester carbon in plants and in soils, but there comes a limit. Okay, and the limit is usually dependent on soil type, dependent on what your actual practice, land use practice is, but there is always a finite sink, so you just have to be careful about that as well. And shifting pasture to biomass. The thing that is very, shifting from pasture to biomass, the one big question is who gets the credits. So if you have a co-firing target and a farmer is growing biomass for co-firing in a peat burning power station, agriculture doesn't see the credits of the actual co-firing, and also in terms of heat production. And then in work, they're looking at different policies to adopt. So carbon taxes, emission standards, emission tradings. What are the best methods for incentivising? Also the interaction with other policies, the nitrates directive, Gothenburg protocols, water framework, habitats and bioenergy targets. Finally, in conclusion, Teagasc, what we're doing is undertaking a mosaic of different solutions, short, medium-term strategies and long-term strategies. We're looking at plant breeding, nutrient management change, feeding, inhibitors, etc. We're focusing mainly on improving production per unit product. That seems to be the future. It makes sense that in a community, a global community, where there's high demand, that you reduce your emissions per unit product, and looking at farm-scale integrated approach. But we have to set this in the right policy framework. We have to set the incentives or the policy, that the programme under which these mitigation strategies are put in place. We have to get that right. And finally, and most vitally, we have to have a mechanism whereby we can input these abatement strategies into national inventories. If we don't do that, then there are big problems, really. And thank you very much.